don't you tell us who you are and where you are?
All right, so my name's Evan McMullen. I'm currently in the Detroit metro area in Michigan. Currently, I work as a mechatronics engineer, but I've done a lot of other things. I've been a teacher. I've been a hermit and psychedelic explorer. I've had quite a random set of experiences in my life, but one of the sort of through lines of everything that I've done has been looking at the relationship between systems and uncertainty, you know, the sort of classic questions of epistemology. How can we know what we know? What does it mean to know things, et cetera? So that's the sort of overarching lens that I tend to take on things. So anything else you'd like to know about me, or should we just get right into a conversation?
No, that's terrific. You and I have been sort of standing up for a certain kind of insight within discussion spaces that are full of very smart, very integrated, well-meaning, serious people. And they frequently invoke fractals, holarchy, and scale invariant improvements to our government systems and our social self-organization processes. And there is validity to that. But outside of a small scale, outside of a small limit, let's say, you and I have been arguing that scale is extremely important to take seriously. Organizational approaches that work great with 5 people are not the same in a village or a city or the whole planet. So we generally can't just reduplicate the same basic pattern at different scales, because the scale itself is a highly significant qualitative factor in the behavior of complex systems. Like, I think
Absolutely.
if people just think of the difference 1 degree makes between 99 and 100 degrees, that 1 degree is a radical change in the behavior of what the water is doing. So where's the first place your mind goes on this topic?
Well, you know, so something I've been thinking a lot about recently is, I guess you would say, the conflict between the sort of approach of viewing a given complex system as, in some sense, a living system or an ecosystem of living systems, versus looking at it as the sort of thing which can be approached from a more traditional engineering perspective. And I think that sort of gets at part of the crux of the position that you and I have found ourselves trying to represent in these conversations versus the positions that we might be critiquing, right? Saying that, you know, hey, sometimes you actually have to view these things as having some level of aliveness to them. And maybe, you know, the phrase that you might pick out of somebody like Stephen Wolfram is irreducible complexity, right? Where, in fact, the entire approach that is very familiar to me as an engineer, where you design the system in a top-down way, where your theory maps on very well to the realities of the system, that this is actually inappropriate when you're looking at sufficiently large numbers of humans interacting together in this system that we call politics, right? And so I guess that's a good way into what I've been thinking about in this area recently and so I guess another distinction we could bring up, because in the sort of communities that we both frequent, you hear the word fractal tossed around a lot, right? And I think it's important to point to the distinction between just a simple fractal and what you might refer to as a multifractal system. So are you familiar with this distinction?
Yep, go.
Cool. Yeah. So in this distinction, the important thing here is that when you think of a simple fractal, like, say, you know, the classic snowflake or the tree that's a fractal, or a Sierpinski fractal or something like that, there's only one fractional exponent required to represent that complexity, right? And then when you look at the sort of fractal systems that you see in nature, these are often multifractal systems where they require multiple fractional exponents in order to describe the dynamics of the system. And I think that politics, you know, it's nice to talk about politics or governance or things like that as having fractal properties, but the question is, what kind of fractal system are we talking about here? And is it as simple as a snowflake where the complexity is identical and recapitulated at each layer, or is it thornier and more complicated than that? And I think that that's sort of one way to get a lens into the distinction that you and I are both picking up on here.
People love fractals because it seems like, I mean, obviously it's aesthetically pleasing and it reminds them of psychedelic experiences, mystical visions, Indra's necklace, monads within monads, where you're going to keep seeing the same thing infinitely in all directions. And it's a very nice way of kind of balancing order and chaos in a single image, the simple fractal. But most systems involve too many moving parts to be able to be handled in that way. just a couple of moving parts, a couple of interacting variables is all you need to get to a place where you basically have no capacity to top-down engineer a system or predict its linear behavior in any significant way. Like one of the classic scale variance problems is you can throw an ant off the roof of a building, but if you throw an elephant or a horse, that's it, they're done, right? Because the rate at which their size increases is different than the rate at which the effects of gravity on them increase, right? So these
square cube relationships are a
create
bit
a mystery, and we have to solve mysterious systems, and complex systems and multifractals are mysterious systems. So we have to set up ways to work well with mysterious systems very differently than if we assume the system is a mechanism we understand.
Exactly. And so, I think from a sort of integral inclined perspective, an interesting way at looking at this is our understanding of systems per se, mathematical modeling of systems and so on, is associated with a certain stage of development, right? There's lots of different ways to slice up the different stages, and there's some debate about which ones are the best, but regardless, they all pretty much identify a certain stage which is associated with the sort of modernist way of describing things as mathematical systems, right? And this is a really powerful, awesome method of analysis, right? We get lots of cool things. The devices that we're talking on right now and so on are a result of the power of this way of looking at the world. But in most of these integral models, you have the sort of idea of later stages that transcend and include earlier stages, right? And so to me, this suggests an interesting sort of path forward with this sort of discussion where we look at, okay, how did cultures before this sort of modernist view look at these things, right? And what might we have thrown out? What baby might we have thrown out with the bathwater in our transition to the sort of modernist view that leads us to analyze things in terms of predictable mathematical systems, to look at everything as an engineering problem, et cetera, right? For me, I think that sometimes, I've spoken of this in other places, that sometimes the things that we might have at some point dismissed as, pre-scientific thinking actually are a lot more informative ways to think about things than to think about it in a rigorously scientific way. And so I've used the example before of the concept of an egregore, right? So this is the concept from Western occultism, essentially, looking at the way that collective thought forms might have their own entityness or their own reality, right? And so I think that our social systems, especially when mediated through the internet, are so complicated that actually it might, be a relevant thing to sort of look to the past and say, okay, well, maybe this is the sort of thing they were talking about when they bring up the notion of an egregore. And you have people even in the sort of rationalist community and the diaspora from Less Wrong kind of inventing or identifying egregores, right? And it's like everything old is new again. And so I think more of that, please, is one way to approach this. But then also we can take a look directly from the sort of rational or analytical perspective and say, well, what are the problems with assuming that political structure should be invariant with respect to scale, and so we've got the same basic structure where you have the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches with very similar interrelationships operating at everything from the level of a tiny little township all the way up to the United States of America. And so we could go in either of those directions, I think, as far as how to sort of take a look at this issue.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be a range in which that kind of a structure, where you've got judges and executives and representative bodies, seems to work okay in that range from town to nation, and maybe a couple stages in between. It doesn't seem to work too well on a smaller scale, within the family. Doesn't.
Right.
Really have no idea what kind of governance approaches would be operative at the planetary scale. How different is a planetary scale from a national scale? I don't think we have that information.
Right. And so we can say, well, what do we know about this, right? And to me, one of the most important things that we can learn from ecology and looking at ecosystems is the danger of monocultures, right? Especially at scale. So if just imagine you're a country and your main crop is a single variant of corn or soy or something like that, then a single bad virus that infects that staple crop can lead to countrywide famine, right? versus a country that has, a diversity of different food sources where, some catastrophic event that affects corn won't mean that everybody goes hungry, right? And so we can take this analogy and look at politics and say, or political systems, rather, governance structures, not politics per se. And we can say, okay, so if we have a sort of governance structure monoculture that's applied to an extremely large area, then that becomes an extremely attractive target for what would be the analogy of a virus or something like that in this case. So one thing that I've spent a lot of time thinking about in this particular area, say in the context of the United States where I live, which is of course what I know best, is the increasing amount of federal power and regulation that's resulted from interpretations of the Commerce Clause over time and the rationing effect that that's had. And so what this has done in effect is make the federal government's regulatory abilities extremely attractive targets for infectious particles, which we could think of as lobbyists, as the whole mechanism of regulatory capture. If you have to capture regulators at a whole vast variety of different local scales, then the cost benefit ratio doesn't work out so well for you there as somebody who might have money and want to influence things. On the other hand, if you've got extremely centralized authority that covers a gigantic geography with 350 million plus people, then you can spend a relatively small amount of resources to create relatively large competitive advantages for you in this entire sphere. And so we can look at some of the downsides of that sort of national scale centralization from that perspective, right?
Yeah, that's a really good one, and I want to get into that. The first thing I thought of when you were talking, though, was how different kinds of diversity need to be thought of differently at different scales. Like when you have a small community, or let's say you're living in ancient Rome, right? You're like going to do something as the emperor. Well, you're going to get people from the Jewish quarter. You're going to get people from the Greek quarter. You're going to get the guy from the prostitutes guild or whatever, right? You're going to talk to the representatives, and that's going to be your diversity base. But when you scale it up to contemporary federal politics, it really doesn't make a difference whether the corrupt representative of the military lobbying corporation is a black woman or a white man, right? You still need diversity there, but you need to guarantee that diversity in a different way, and you need to understand it as a perspectival and experiential diversity in order to maximize the collective intelligence of that decision-making body. Whereas at a small scale, you can just think of each prominent group being represented for fairness' sake.
Right. And so what you just brought up is really interesting. The collective intelligence aspect of decision-making and the perspectival diversity required for that. Because I think that's a laudable goal for a lot of contexts. But I think that decision-making actually might become intractable, even to state-of-the-art collective intelligence at a certain scale. And so what I mean by this is that when you look at something the scale of a national government the size of something like the United States or the EU or something of that scale, there's so much information which is relevant to a given decision because of the sort of multifractal regularities or irregularities in the underlying territory, such that even an incredibly perspectively diverse group of extremely smart and concerned and virtuous people, that just may simply be the wrong level to make certain decisions at. And, as you were speaking, what made me think of this is the example that you gave of ancient Rome. One of the things I think that Rome actually did right in this context is that they essentially would go move into an area, knock over whoever was in charge and say, okay, you guys are all under the rule of Rome now. Keep doing everything you were doing, but just pay us some taxes. So they didn't really care to intervene that much in the local administration of most social issues, religious issues, environmental issues, any of the sort of issues that a local government would have had as its primary concern. They didn't really care how you ran your area as long as you paid them some taxes. And so this allowed the collective intelligence to not be a singular collective intelligence where it was the emperor and his counselors making decisions for all these different areas where they had to be applied broadly and universally to vastly divergent circumstances. But the local decision makers were still allowed a great degree of autonomy as far as how to run their societies, with the caveat, of course, that you pay your taxes and you don't attack Roman citizens or whatever. And so that actually suggests an interesting model for how decision making maybe could be distributed more efficiently in an empire scale polity, like say the United States is gigantic, about the same scale as the Roman Empire. And yet we try to concentrate all of those decisions up at the sort of top layer, and with predictably disastrous effects.
There seem to be a handful of strategies for dealing with really high degrees of complexity. One of them is we go to machines. It's the Stephen Wolfram solution. We can offload a lot of that onto systems that handle complexity that we can't comprehend. There's a couple of Nassim Taleb solutions. One is heuristics for dealing with uncertainty, and another one is you offload as much of the decision making to these lower scales as possible. And I think that connects to what you were saying. And then the residual of decisions that are of such significance or of such scale that they cannot be handled at the local ones is therefore minimized, and which is appropriate. So then you have a strategic collective intelligence body of some kind, which then has to operate by its best understanding of how to upload diverse collective perspectives and get an output decision that's actionable.
Yeah, I mean, of those two sort of approaches for dealing with this level of complexity that you suggest, I personally am more partial to the Taleb approach, because with the offload to machines approach, you run into issues that Taleb's very well aware of sort of model uncertainty, right? So you have to be very, very confident that the underlying model of reality that the machine is taking for granted is accurate, right? And even if you have machines which in some sense develop their own models, a la deep learning or other sort of unsupervised learning approaches, you still are vulnerable to what he might call black swan events that haven't happened yet, but have a near certain probability of happening at some point. Well, the machine's not going to be able to learn that that is even a possibility if it's only inspecting historical data to develop its model, right? And if you are programming the model explicitly into the machine, then you have to take into account those probabilities. And if you get them wrong, ooh, that's very bad, right? So I think that the sort of, fractal localism models that Taleb tends to advocate for here are probably the best approach, because among other things, they help contain the risk of failure, right? So if a local area makes extremely bad decisions and has something blow up, has something fail, then that can usually be contained to that local area in a way that is not true if you have a centralized control system that says, okay, we're going to have this really smart AI or this really smart group of people that makes decisions for everybody. Well, then if they happen to have the wrong model, which they almost certainly will at some point, then everybody suffers the consequences.
So there's a model issue and there's a topic issue, right? If the topic is live nuclear weapons, then that's not something we can allow them to test and fail in individual circumstances. When it comes to the models, yeah, there's a conservative and a progressive approach to postmodern, post-rational, post-linear things. One says, let's really favor the human and let's really favor the traditional heuristics, and let's try to keep things as much as possible at lower scales of decision making. And then the other side of that is we absolutely are revving up these machine intelligences that are going to be opaque to us in terms of what they do. So we need a strategy to handle that and a way of trying to get them to do what we want, even though it's high risk, because they're going to be coming online anyway. And also we are learning things about collective intelligence and decision making that might have been exemplified in some of our ancestors' schemes, but which they didn't necessarily have systemic clarity about and therefore couldn't implement in new ways. So we got to handle this left and right of this whole process simultaneously.
Right. So I do have a bit of an issue. I mean, obviously, there are certain things like nuclear proliferation, which require a high degree of central coordination because of the extremely high probability of really bad consequences if that happens. Granted, right? And you might even put the AI explosion in that category as well. But there is a problem that we see with this where, so if you think about the UDO Loop concept, right, then the larger the stakes, all other things being equal, because of the way that human psychology works, the slower and more deliberative the process is going to be, right? So you look at, say, a federal scale Congress or Parliament or whatever, and they tend to have a reputation for taking forever to get things done. And as a result, they build up a sort of technical debt, right? So, I noticed the sort of regulation that is being mooted by these national scale bodies. And they're almost always dealing with the technology of, say, 5 years ago, right? So there's this lag that happens, and this lag compounds itself because of the exponential curve of technology. So even if we might say, well, this is really important to do in a centralized way and get right, you still have the question of, how do you get the central authority to be able to have a fast enough decision loop that it's not just left standing by technological progress, right? And I mean, this is sort of similar. We had some similar dynamics around, say, the period between the Civil War and World War I, where essentially the national scale decision makers had completely, on average, failed to take into account the impact of all these new technologies like railroad, like telegraph, et cetera, on their ability to exert the type of control they were used to exerting. And, you can see World War I and the way that unfolded in some senses as a fairly predictable consequence of that, right? So we have to be able to actually take into account the fact that decisions are going to need to be made fast, because these decisions are in response to technology, which is mutating at an ever faster rate. And the question is it even possible to have a large-scale, centralized, coordinated body that makes those decisions fast enough?
Right. And that's why, none of these approaches will be adequate on their own. Right. So that's why they have to be complementary with each other. The question is, how do you arrange each of them so that they're maximally complementary and cover the maximum number of types of outcomes and problems we're going to face? It seems like, there's a lot of problems with classic pyramidal hierarchies, but the idea of setting a system up to be somewhat minimized at the top rather than maximized at the top is really important in order to have nimbleness in response. Now, there's a lot of other things that's important, right? You have to have people who are quick and process information quickly. Otherwise, a minimalized government won't matter. They'll just, do stupid things quickly.
Yes.
At the same time, we have, it's hard to tell what big is. When people say big government, very often a solution that's a universal program is a way of minimizing that. Sometimes it's not, sometimes it is, right? If you just had single payer healthcare, some people think that sounds like enormous government overreach, but then you can pull back and go, wait, it's cheaper, it's way fewer agents involved in the system, and we could probably run it in a fairly automated way, where right now we're constantly dealing with this shit. So there must be ways to handle things that need to be universal in a way that also affirms this need to minimize things. And I think we definitely have to set parameters. Ideally, we'd set some parameters around what federal governments are capable of dealing with, and set ourselves a goal of legislative simplification.
Well, that gets us into a really interesting question as far as what entities are actually responsible for governance in the systems that we have now. And are those or are those not identical with what we think of as the government? And so my contention here would be that actually a large portion of what we might consider governance that happens today is actually not done by official government actors. And that this varies to some extent between nations, but just generally, a lot of governance is handled by private corporations. And a lot of what we might think of as the government is actually not really in the business of governance per se. So that's one thing that came up for me when you were just speaking to that. And then as far as the right way to balance the sort of top down versus bottom up, I'm a huge fan of biomimicry when it comes to design. I think that often nature gets it right. And so I think you can look at examples, say, of the way that bodies, human bodies or animal bodies, responds to physical traumas as being an interesting, model for this, right? Because a small level of physical trauma that happens, say you get a small paper cut on your finger or something like that, depending on the scale of the damage there's going to be some level of inflammation. There's going to be some level of cytokine release. There's going to be all this signaling that happens. And depending on the magnitude of that issue, then it will either be handled mostly locally or the sort of central authorities will get involved in handling it. And this just completely, there's a sort of distributed system whereby the lower layers have enough intelligence to signal to each other, and then enough parts of the lower layer signaling becomes a signal to the higher layer, essentially, right? And so I think that that might be a good place to start looking as far as how we might design governance structures that can sort of have the best of both worlds here, or to optimize for these two seemingly conflicting targets.
Yeah, there's got to be a lot more distributed control. And so there has to be a very clear idea about what range of circumstances is pertinent to local control. Who was that guy Trump first put in charge of the military when he got in?
Mattis?
Yeah, Mattis. Now, Mattis has had some interesting ideas that didn't really get implemented that he'd been talking about for years. And one of them was, if you can get a real clarity of mission from the civilian governments, and you can really send that clarity of mission down the chain, then the local commanders can take action instead of getting blown up while they're waiting for it to go up the chain and come back down again. But that only works on a certain range of problems, and if you have an extremely clear message. So we're assuming that the cells and the central control system of bodies all know what they want, which is to survive and thrive. As long as you can get that coordination, and then what are the limits of getting that coordination?
Right. Well, I think this speaks to the increasing level of complexity in the world. This is something that's not a new observation. The human world seems to be a lot more complex now than it was 100 years ago, right? Let alone the almost 300 years ago it was when modern democratic systems were first put into place. And so one thing I think that might need to change a little bit is the idea of a static scope of authority for various levels of government. And this is one thing that's implied by that sort of biomimicry analogy I was just speaking of. So it's not like we can necessarily define these are the issues for which a federal level response is required. More that we need to have a way for the local levels to aggregate their signal in a bottom-up direction to bring the attention of federal power to a certain set of issues or a certain issue. But that this may change from year to year, from moment to moment, as far as what needs that level of attention, that level of control or power applied to it, right? And so we can't just say, like, to use the body analogy, we can't just say anytime there's a laceration, this needs full, like, top-down control, because some of those are minor and the local can handle it just fine. On the other hand, if you get your arm cut off, well then, yeah, you definitely want the central authority to be looking at that and trying to figure out solutions. And so the thing is, well, what's cutting off our arm at a given moment? That's changing pretty rapidly. And so I think that, the old democratic systems, the systems that most countries are operating under, act as though the things which require centralized coordination are going to remain relatively static over time. I think that's a mistaken assumption in today's world, and that needs to be reevaluated when looking at governance structures.
Yeah, absolutely. Taking time and change into account in how we evaluate those things and setting up systems that are capable of mutating to fit the circumstance is essential.
Exactly.
There's a problem around treating all problems as if they're the same kind of problem, because getting that coordination, like when those soldiers understand the mission, right, and those cells understand that when they can collectively register something and it's engaging to them, then they can coordinate on it locally rather than getting a central authority involved. Now, right, if there's a guy wandering around shooting people in the neighborhood, everybody can pretty much figure out what needs to get done. They might not have the resources, but they understand what the problem is and they're willing to coordinate on it. There's a ton of issues in a bureaucratic system that are so disinteresting to almost everyone, or so unknown by most people, that they never viscerally register it and therefore can't really collectively mobilize at a small scale.
So just so I'm clear on that, what are some examples of those sorts of issues? Because I think I know what you're pointing at, but I just want to be sure.
Yeah, like, well, what should the local tax policy be on the importation of animal furs? Right?
Okay.
You know what I mean? Like, there might be one or two people that really clearly understands that issue, but it's not like the pothole that's in everybody's face every day, right? There's not necessarily a lot of engaged coordination on abstract sounding issues.
Gotcha. Okay, so then
that's why it normally gets kicked up to an abstract decision-making body, but every time you kick it up, you get one step removed and you entangle yourself in a huge machinery that's probably going to go off the rails at some scale.
Yeah, that I mean, that certainly is a problem. Though I wonder again, maybe this is my old libertarian leanings shining through. I wonder why we need to actually have policy surrounding something like the example you gave. Like, is it if it's not a problem for people, then maybe we just, like, whatever is currently the status quo, we just let it sit there, right? Okay, we currently tax exotic fur imports at 5% or whatever. We just keep doing that. Or we currently don't tax them. We just keep doing that. And we see, what happens until it becomes relevant to people.
Right, except that there are things that when they become relevant to people, it's sort of too late already, right? Like there's a slow buildup of pollution in the water supply, and by the time anybody detects it, the kids are all dead. There's a scale problem in our ability to detect these problems. But there's something I thought about earlier that I want to touch in on a little bit. Like we have these feelings about how systems should be organized that aren't necessarily attuned to scale. Like a lot of people, when they think about federal economics, they think about it like it's a household, and it doesn't really operate like a household, right? So then there's things where you're like, well, there's freedom and there's the government. We have these different scales, but we don't necessarily, I forget how I was connecting this. It was relative to what you were saying about large private corporations essentially operating like governments. And we treat them, we like to treat them, and they benefit from us treating them as if they were small businesses to some degree, right? They benefit from a social ethos that doesn't see that difference in scale, that although they say, hey, we're a private corporation, we're just trying to do business in the market like everybody else, they're operating in the manner and at the scale of governments. And yet we don't collectively get together to require the things of them that we're trying to require of state and federal governments. So if we're going to start thinking about these multiple scales, we have to have a very generalized notion of what a government is or what a collective body is of some kind, so that we can not necessarily treat them equally, but make sure they're all taken into account and nobody's let off the hook because they don't count as government.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thought that came to mind when you were outlining that set of problems is the concept that Taleb's all about of skin in the game, right? Yeah. Looking at decision makers having skin in the game. And I think that kind of applies to both, say, federal scale governments as well as to multinational corporations that are acting, in loco government or whatever, right? Where they're not really bearing much of the cost of their decisions. And so they're not really incentivized to make good decisions. So the question then becomes, how do we tie decision making to having some actual stake in the consequences? I think that's a critically important part of good government or good governance that has been more or less underemphasized or lost in recent times.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely essential. And it sort of has two reciprocal aspects, where one is, how do you arrange the current body of decision makers so that they have more skin in the game, so that they are affected by the consequences of their decisions? And the other side of it is the classic unions and cooperatives and workers voting and making the decision-making body out of people who already have skin in the consequences of how things go. So both of those have to operate somehow together.
Absolutely. And I think that, we could take this. So the example you just gave of worker cooperatives, unions, that sort of thing, we could look at our current economic structure in general and say that in the one sense, say shareholders, they've got a lot of skin in the game. They've got their investment, their retirement, their money is that's their skin in the game. And so therefore they deserve to have some sort of say in how corporations are run, right? We've very much underemphasized the people that spend, 8 or 10 hours of their life every day working for a given corporation, because they've got a lot of skin in the game, but they've got basically no authority or no political power within the governance of such corporations. And so, predictably, this leads to corporations imposing essentially externalities on their employees in order to capture benefits for their shareholders. And so this seems like a fairly easy win in terms of more just governance there, to say, well, we should encourage governance structures of corporations where workers have authority proportional to their skin in the game, right? And this is, of course, the idea behind, say, most startups offering most of their compensation in terms of stock. Well, that solves the problem by saying the workers are the shareholders. They're the same group. So that aligns the incentive structure pretty nicely there. On the other hand, even in, say, the startup ecosystem, we've got the third group, which is to say the society or public at large, because you can still have a startup which imposes significant negative externalities on society while still doing very well for both its employees and its shareholders. And we've seen any number of examples of companies like that recently. And so I think that is an interesting lens into how we could structure things better. What sort of considerations, even like, forget how we do it, what might we want to think about when we're deciding how to do it? Well, looking and saying that the general public, as well as the owners, as well as the employees of a given sector, probably all ought to have some stake in how the decisions are made, because they all have some skin in the game with respect to the consequences of those decisions.
Yeah, everybody's engaged. Well, not everybody, but a large number of different stakeholders are engaged in different proportions. Seems to me there's a lot of classical political and economic arguments that get stuck because they use very narrow kinds of definitions. Like if somebody makes a socialist critique that the workers are providing all the real value, right? They're leaving out the idea that the bosses and entrepreneurs and capitalists are also doing some work. So you got to expand that concept. Likewise, if somebody says, well, they deserve massive proportion of the reward because they took the risk. Well, everybody else has taken a risk too. It's their job, it's their family, it's their time, it's their community, it's their water supply. So all of these terms need to be expanded in a considerable way so that we can get a map of what's really going on and not reduce ourselves into some kind of pointless left-right argument that always stalemates and avoids causing any change to the system that we live in.
And that's a really interesting point, because the last thing that you just said there, getting into a stalemate that avoids any real change to the system. Now, I don't want to posit any conspiracy here, but it seems like an emergent property, at the very least, of the system that we currently live in is that seems to be its main feature, is to avoid making changes to the system, right? And I think that's very interesting, because it's a lot easier to avoid doing something than it is to do something. In general, humans, I think, are wired such that if you take an affirmative action that has bad consequences, you're definitely going to get blamed for that. Whereas if you simply fail to take an action and then failing to take the action had some bad consequences, then you might still be blamed, but you're going to be seen as less blameworthy due to the quirks of human psychology. And I think that's a major problem that we need better social technology to sort of route around, right? You can see this sort of the effects of this in, say, various responses to the COVID-19 situation, where actions are taken which are inherently conservative, or rather actions are not taken because it's a lot easier to keep your job if you just do everything by the book, follow the process, right? Versus taking a certain action that might have very good consequences, but is noticeable. You're sticking out in that sense, right? And so I think that dynamic really informs a lot of the sort of gridlock that we see politically, is because nobody wants to be the one that you can blame for something. So, this sort of bureaucratic diffusion of responsibility is a major ossifying influence on our ability to adapt to a vastly complexifying world, rapidly complexifying world.
Yeah, I think the modern operating system, whatever that is, right? It's metastable in some really interesting ways that often look like they're disagreeing with each other, but it's an engine that uses those polarities the same way it uses a prosecutor and a defense attorney, or it has the main party and the loyal opposition. They are a loyal opposition in many respects. So there's a dialectic machinery in modernity that allows it to insulate itself from a lot of the things that go on in the world, even to the point where, it doesn't take a lot of sophistication. I mean, it's very sophisticated, but it doesn't take a lot of sophistication as an organism. You don't have to be a human being to be able to use deception, right? Very simple organisms have decoy body parts. And I think a lot of revolutionary movements go after the decoy body part in the modern operating system, and therefore end up causing no change. right? It just takes off a useless limb that you thought was the center of the problem, and then it regrows that limb. So not only is it really good at insulating itself from its negative effects, corruption, pollution, all these things that it's producing as side effects to its progress, it's insulating itself from, but it rewards the insulation of the agents within that system, whether they be corporate executives or government agents. We treat as merit their ability to move themselves farther and farther from the consequences of their action, to the point where you could crash the economy and get a huge paycheck for that.
Yeah. And I mean, that sort of dynamic that you just described is critically important, and is part of why I brought up the idea that the actual institutions doing governance are not identical with the formalized structures of government, because that is one of the major crypsis strategies that you see being executed in the manner that you described, where we think that the people to blame for things going wrong would be Congress or the president or the courts or something like that, right? But those are not actually the bodies making a lot of the decisions that are relevant to day-to-day life. On the one hand, you have, of course, the, corporations acting with the level of power that normally we would associate with states. That's one side of this. And then the other side is, and again, I'm most familiar with the American examples here, but the vast amount of administrative law, which is made by federal government bureaucrats of the executive branch, because Congress has delegated their authority to regulate some area to the executive branch, the department of so-and-so, the bureau of so-and-so. And so you can't oust these guys in an election, right? Because they're not elected. So, it's a sort of shell game in a certain sense, right? Don't watch what this hand is doing over here. Watch this big flashy hand over here in the spectacle. And I mean, that's a huge problem right now, is the obfuscation or crypsis of where decisions are actually made. And I think that's a huge topic. We could spend an entire conversation on talking about, how do we even notice where the decisions are being made? And then once we have noticed that, what are the strategies for causing better decisions to be made at those levels? I mean, it's a really complicated set of issues right there.
Yeah, if we had a more general notion of what a decision-making group consists of and what a decision-making agent consists of, so that we could track that at different scales, then we could start to analyze this in a more sensible way. Right now, we've got to assume that a lot of decisions are being made by apparent decision-making bodies, and a lot of decisions are being made by non-apparent decision-making bodies, and that they're both gummed up by people who are incentivized to skim the system and insulate themselves from the results, to even the point to which elected representatives suffer very little negative feedback at the ballot box for doing things which are not in alignment with the will of their constituents, right? Because they're backed up by a party structure, and the party structure to some extent doesn't even care if it wins elections as long as that money keeps coming in. In the kind of information ecology we have, you can do all kinds of things that your voters hate, and that doesn't really punish you at the ballot box for that, partly because they don't know, partly because they've been hacked into a few simplistic culture war issues that makes them unconcerned about your actual behavior, and partly because it's hard and time consuming to track that stuff. So that, I mean, I bring up this issue about having some kind of membrane, having some kind of secret ballot in legislative bodies, because the voters are not inspecting these processes with any kind of closeness or consistency or clarity. The only people really inspecting them are financial backers and party structures. So we've got to look at what are the interference. One system of increasing complex of intelligence is what kind of protocols actually get the information out of people better and put it together better. And the whole other side of that is, where would it actually work pretty well if it wasn't being constantly hacked by interfering forces?
Yeah, that's a really good set of questions to look at. And I like the analogy here with that you made a couple minutes ago with looking at things as an OS, right? Like looking at, okay, we've got this civilizational OS, right? Because I think this goes back to some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier in reference to, say, the dangers of monocultures, right? When you have an OS monoculture, it makes it a lot easier for viruses to spread, right? The days of everybody getting bad viruses from the internet were enabled in large part because 90% of people were running Microsoft Windows, and Microsoft Windows has a lot of similarities to our current government structure, and that because it's closed source, you can't actually audit how it's making its decisions internally, right? You just have to kind of, okay, this is the system we've got, and also it's a monoculture. 90% of people are running it. So you write a virus that targets Windows, and then boom, you're good. You've got 90% of the internet on lock, provided that there's a security hole that you can exploit. When you compare this to a system where we have standardized protocols for information transfer, right? There's no reason, like I could connect to your website over HTTPS and SSL, and I could be running some bizarre minor operating system that some academic wrote. I could be running Plan 9. I could be running any of the varieties of Linux or Unix or, whatever, B operating system. And because we have a shared protocol defined for information transfer, we can still access the same resources. And then we can have our own internal OS processes that make decisions about what to do with the data received in very different ways. And I think that this is actually an interesting metaphor for the sort of problems that we have in this political sphere that we've been discussing, where this goes back to scale varying versus scale invariant political structures, that we essentially have a single OS that's being executed at a wide variety of scales among a wide variety of nodes. And so this OS is essentially vulnerable to the same sort of hacking techniques that can attack it at all different levels because it is a monoculture in that way. And so I think that a really interesting and fruitful area of political design space to explore is the information exchange protocols between different layers, both horizontally and vertically. So different nodes at a given layer, how do those communicate between each other? What are the protocols there? And similarly, vertical layers, okay, say state to federal or state to local, local to municipal, et cetera. What are the protocols for information exchange up and down for signaling both information content and information, severity or importance? That seems to be what we have to really get right, because if we can get that right, then the system as a whole can be pretty resilient. On the other hand, if we get that wrong, then we're a political monoculture just like we are now that might just have a different set of problems.
Yeah, there's a conversation that should be going on in communities where people are thinking about developmental stages, and it's not going on. And they think about the emergence of stages, right? In the sense that Windows comes out and it's wrapped around a DOS shell.
Right.
Okay, right. So we've got that. But one of them gets basically monopolistic market dominance, and it stands in for all possible versions at that scale. Right. So we have the modernity that we have. We don't have the only possible kind of modernity, and we have a disturbingly homogeneous modernity that could be crashed from the same factors. And we're not really looking at what are the right kinds of modernity, what are the alternatives, and how would they relate well to certain alternatives of the pre-modern system and the postmodern system, right? When people talk about, say, postmodernity, they very often think about it as a left-wing communitarian, there's this whole spiral dynamics terminology about how these stages are alternating between autonomy and communion. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that they're looking at a very small sample of the obvious predominant version that we happen to have had, and not thinking about the space of variations or about how many variations would be more optimal in that range. Right? How many greens should we have? How many oranges should we have? How do they talk to each other? How do we keep, say, modernity from absolutely ruining the life world of pre-modernity upon which it actually depends?
Yeah, I really love that. I mean, that's such a great analogy there, because this is again a conversation that should be happening. It's sort of like if you had people who were to go back to our sort of intertwined computer analogy, you have a bunch of people who are talking about how graphical user interfaces suck. And they're comparing Windows to DOS, right? They're saying, man, DOS was so much better because of these factors. We should all go back to DOS. And they're completely ignoring all of the other possible paradigms for having a graphical user interface versus all the possible paradigms for having a command line interface, right? And they're restricting the scope of the debate to a very narrow set of things. And I think that especially when you talk about moving into the sort of postmodern and potentially, meta-modern or whatever comes after postmodernity, when we look at these phases or stages, it's really interesting how we seem to have these conversations assuming a certain set of definite characteristics for each of these. Like you mentioned, say the individualistic versus collectivistic is one axis we could look at this on. And it's sort of like complaining about graphical user interface based operating systems because they have terrible security. And you're doing this because you only understand Windows, when you're forgetting that there's Linux, there's Unix, there's all these other operating systems out there that actually don't suffer that problem. It's not an inherent feature of them being a graphical user interface that makes them insecure. It's about very particular contingent path-dependent decisions that went into the design of Windows that made it insecure. And similarly, so when we talk about, say, moving from modernity to postmodernity, or if people think we're already in postmodernity, moving to meta-modernity or whatever they want to say comes next, there's a sort of constraint of the design space that is being implicitly assumed that I think is a big mistake, right? Because we're going to end up taking some of the worst features of our current version of modernity, as you put it, and porting those into as a basis for the flowering of a postmodernity or meta-modernity, but with some structural flaws at its roots. And definitely looking at things in that light is really important, and it is an underemphasized conversation, I would say, especially the individualist versus collectivist, especially as it tends to get reified into a sort of left versus right political discourse in a lot of spaces. That's probably destructive to our ability to conceptualize what comes after modernity in a sort of pro-social and pro-life, pro-earth kind of way,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if anybody who takes a quick look at the Wilberforce quadrants map ought to assume that all of these are present in all of the stages and that they have to be. But we really don't pay much attention to the collective aspect of modernity, because modernity's hype about itself revolves around the individual inventor, entrepreneur, explorer with their individual reason, even though they're part of a whole system. Whole sets of communities and organizations and things are operating there. And the same thing with postmodernity. We don't pay very much attention to the autonomous and or right-wing postmodernist at all. They fall right out of the discussion. And as a result, the ability to implement sane postmodern systems is extraordinarily compromised because we don't have a good summary of what those systems would consist of, and we don't have alliances among the people who are operating from those levels.
Yeah, it's turning into a bit of a zero-sum game of who gets to define the postmodern future based on pre-existing political divisions, and that's a real shame. I mean, what you were just saying about the sort of the idea of modernity as focusing on the individual inventor, the individual entrepreneur, and that being the sort of shared cultural mythos. Well, that's quite interesting. Shared cultural mythos. Well, that's a collective thing, right? That's a collectively defining thing. And so it's sort of maybe in some Jungian sense shadowed in our conception of modernity, but modernity obviously involves probably the greatest number of people ever sharing a cultural mythology. And that's a very collective aspect of modernity, right? It is, we're all part of this one collective for the first time. And that's very underemphasized in these discussions surrounding the various integral stages, however, whichever spiral dynamics or other maps you want to use, for sure. I think that's a very interesting point.
There's another feature of all this that I'd like to take a look at, and that's differences of scale in terms of intervals, in terms of time intervals and distance intervals, right? Like rats are fairly well behaved unless you put too many of them in the same space, so then they rape and murder each other. Or there's no pecking order in the wild, so to speak, right? The observations of the pecking order are based on chickens in a confined space with an artificially confined amount of food where they can't spread out and get different food sources, right? So we collapse the scale of their interrelational distances. And one of the problems with the culture war might be a bit like that, where the sense of how far away you are from other people's opinions gets collapsed because you're constantly exposed to them. You can't spend time ignoring the foreigner and have your group be its group until you feel fairly secure to interact with them. You're constantly besieged. It's as if it's in your face all the time. That's right. As if hearing about gay marriage means you're going to have to get gay married. There's an absolute collapse of the distance. You feel like it's right at you all of a sudden. Right. So we need to be attentive to the amount of temporal and physical and informational conceptual space people need in order to function as fairly sovereign members of some kind of collective intelligence system.
Yeah, this exact dynamic is the reason that I do favor the sort of distributed localism models of governance, all other things being equal, because of that exact problem you just mentioned. So one of the reasons that people care so much about national scale politics is because of the enormous power of the federal government to make policy at a level that applies to 350 million people. So, you have to worry about, this classic refrain of, well, what are these people in Washington making decisions that are going to affect me out here in Alabama or Arkansas or Michigan or wherever, right? Well, it's an incredibly tempting target for capturing power if you have something that can impose your will on 350 million people, right? Or in the case of the United States government, through its bloated military industrial complex, on most of the world's population to some degree. You can impose your values on them. Whereas if we have a more distributed and local government structure, then the debates about values will probably happen at a level where people have more in common in the first place, right? It doesn't necessarily bother you, like, okay, maybe you hear that people out in California are getting gay married, but nobody in your little community is caring too much about that or whatever. And maybe that's a bad example because that issue seems to be fairly widely distributed. There are going to be people with some skin in that game no matter where you go. It's just a question of whether they're allowed to talk about it. But for a lot of things, I think this model does work, where we can say, okay, so part of the reason that culture war issues have become so charged, so polarized, and so central to the political discourse is because of the enormous power of the government to change culture by fiat, essentially. Whereas if things were happening at a more local level, then people's incentives would already be more aligned with each other. And then probably the things that needed to move up to the larger scales might be those more boring technical issues that, yeah, they technically affect all of us and we got to figure this out, but maybe there would be less emotional charge associated with them.
Emotional charge is a component of what I would call the interface problem. And I've got two sides of that. One side is I'd sit down with my older brother, always be like, I'm not the user of the internet. I need a thing. It's got to use the internet for me. How am I going to get this? Right. And he'd be like, oh, you can build one of those in Linux. I'm like, hey, you crazy? I'm not going to use Linux. Right. Because there's an interface problem. It's so much easier and so much more engaging to use Windows. Likewise, federal politics, right back to emperors, right? They are a very engaging figure. Yeah, the middle guy is not so engaging. Local politics is not so engaging. There's a high conceptual and emotional barrier to entry. And when people bring forth federal politics, that's where the money is. That's where the ads are. That's where the simplified narratives are. That's where the crazy characters are, right? It's so much easier to engage. So if we want to distribute power, we've got to really up our game on the interfaces.
Yeah, and I mean, the interface is made up of two components. It's made up of the external component and the internal component. And this, I think, is actually one of the most actionable things for people to actually work on, is to work on the internal component of interfacing, right? Now, my personal approach to this involves things like meditation and so on. There's lots of different approaches, just being engaged with your physical environment a little bit more through various, just taking a walk in the woods or what have you, or if you live in a city, taking a walk through your local neighborhood, seeing the sights, getting to know your neighbors. But, I think that the concept of attentional hijacking versus attentional sovereignty is incredibly important to bring into any discussion of politics, especially one from a somewhat integral or staged framing, because this is really a lot of these issues that we have probably wouldn't be nearly so big an issue if people were able to more consciously control what they pay attention to and what they don't. In other words, to notice the actual relevance of a given decision at a given level to their lives, and to decide, hey, I may prefer this decision to have gone another way, but it has epsilon level of relevance to my own actual day-to-day life. So I'm not going to get so worked up about it, right? Whereas the current system of political and media engagement is an upward ratcheting dynamic whereby we are incentivized to pay attention to things that barely affect our daily lives. And we are incentivized to do this through mechanisms which destroy our ability to control our own attention and to notice what's relevant to our daily lives. So you get an upward ratcheting effect here where we spend almost all of our time noticing and caring about things that have precisely zero impact on us in any practical sense, right? And so bringing that sort of dynamic into the equation of looking at governance, I think, is critical.
I think that's right, but the difficulty there is that it seems to require a huge population of people with advanced executive prefrontal cortex abilities, strong meditators, a lot of self-control, very well informed, able to gauge significances relative to their own lives very well. And for most people, those are skills it takes a lifetime to acquire, if they're ever acquired. So we've got to also be able to design interfaces for people that don't have great skills in those areas. There was a conversation very recently between Schmachtenberger and Brett Weinstein, and they were talking about different kinds of dopamine incentive structures, right? The one you get from a piece of cake and the one you get from exercise. The first, with the exercise one, it sucks at first, but it does become increasingly viscerally engaging. Whereas the icing sugar, it's immediately viscerally engaging, and then it sort of drops off in your well-being after time. But they didn't talk very much about gamification, about engineering flow states, because flow states have a mix of delayed gratification and immediate gratification in a way that makes people obviously viscerally engaged, right? If we can build game architecture and just pump it out and the kids are hooked on it, why can't we have engagements with politics that are in the same fashion? Why doesn't it feel awesome to vote in a local election? Right? Even for a person without much internal intentional control over their attention and evaluation processes.
So why doesn't it feel awesome to vote in a local election? Well, again, I think the problem goes even deeper than that. Many people in the group you're describing don't even know when the local election is. Right. So how are they going to have the feeling of voting in it one way or the other, right? It's
assuming the information's available. Why doesn't it feel awesome to get the information then?
Right. And so this is a very interesting question. I mean, this goes back, I think, to the concept of a sort of evolutionary superstimulus, right? This is something that Daniel and company have discussed a lot in various venues, where we have things which are more rewarding than anything we evolved to deal with. The example of the Snickers bar versus any food that existed before, 200 years ago or something like that, right? And we have, of course, the informational equivalence of that, right? I mean, we have some of the very smartest people in the world working on gamification of things like social media, who have discovered, of course, that outrage is the most addictive emotion, essentially, right? And humans do have, we've established for a long time, humans have a sort of built-in negativity bias, where negative things are going to be more grabbing of our attention and more noteworthy than positive things. So even though it feels bad to engage with social media repeatedly, it hacks our reward infrastructure such that we do it. And then we fall prey to all these dynamics. So this is why I didn't just mention things like meditation, because I don't think you have to become some master of the attentional arts to reverse this decline. I think that, like I said, going for a walk in your neighborhood, engaging with human beings doing the sort of things that human beings do, deciding to have a night where you play board games with your friends rather than that you spend on Discord and gaming on this more addictive online platform. That's the sort of decision point which is still in reach of most people, I think, right? Now, maybe they're not going to commit to a lifetime of meditation, and maybe that's acceptable, right? That's got to be fine. But I really think, and this is a sort of key to a lot of the suggestions I would make in a lot of different areas, is to emphasize the aspect of being human that has to do with embodiment, with experiencing what it's like to be a physical being that it inhabits a physical space. A lot of the dynamics that we're talking about here are sort of generated by a sort of upward, head-oriented, abstraction-oriented way of being, where visual input is prized as opposed to physical sensory input from the body. And you don't have to go meditate in a cave to get that input from the body. You can go for a walk. You can play with your cat or dog. You can, even sitting down and like playing a board game or playing charades or doing some goofy dance thing or whatever with your friends will subtly reorient your attention to the here and now in a way that is not a formalized meditation, but I think is actually a somewhat powerful antidote to this ongoing escalation of the outrage machine, which we are all plugged into.
Yeah, there's some elements of that. There's some wiggle room in everybody's experience where they can take advantage of some processes that will help to clarify, engage, and reset them. At the same time, there's a huge skewing of that because it's proportional to a whole bunch of what we might call privileged circumstances, right? Assuming you're not, assuming you can breathe because you're not dying of COVID, right? Assuming you have friends, assuming you didn't just lose your job, assuming you're not in constant anxiety, assuming you're in a city where you're in any way able to access nature, right? All these things, assuming your food hasn't totally poisoned you, all this sort of, right? So there's a lot of people, and around the world, there's a lot of people in even worse situations where they don't really have a lot of opportunity. And that opportunity could be the internal opportunity of being reminded or having any kind of personal experience or skills training in this domain to know that they have the opportunity to try that out once in a while. So there's, some larger systemic things need to provide the support conditions under which people can, in greater percentages, take advantage of those facts to renormalize and clarify themselves so that they are a better system participant with a lower requirement for addictive interfaces.
Yeah, I think that both bottom up and top down dynamics here are going to be necessary or required if we're going to get through this, so to speak, right? Because interestingly enough, this sort of emphasis on like local human interaction, on experience of nature, of, working with your own awareness is actually, I think, one of the few things that is not really a politically charged left versus right topic. Right. It's one thing that I personally find refreshing. If you go to the local farmers market or permaculture meetup or something like that, even, you'll find that it hasn't been polarized as much compared to a lot of the other sort of domains that would normally be considered hobbies or eccentric interests or something. It's, you look at people on what might be considered the sort of far left and the far right, and this is actually one of the things that they can kind of agree on. Right. And I think that from that base, there can be a sort of rehumanization of each other where we notice that, like, hey, this is important to me. And it's also important to these other guys over here that I disagree with about nearly everything. But we both really care about this thing. And I think that rehumanization is going to be a necessary bottom up component. Right. We can't necessarily do that from the top down. The top down incentive structures of the global scale media are going to remain to polarize and to cultivate outrage and so on, right? And so I guess the question then is, well, what can we build this sort of shared sense of our common humanity and the shared returning to a sense of embodiment and not just being creatures of the mind, but being creatures, right? And so for me, I find some great hope in that bottom-up dynamic there. And then, of course, we can combine that with top-down dynamics. And people are working on this sort of thing, say gamified meditation apps. Well, kind of creepy, but also probably a good thing, right? And again, sort of looking at the sort of incentive hacking that has been pioneered by the big media companies and social media companies and thinking, okay, well, the wonderful thing about information technology is that once somebody's done something, it's usually pretty quick to be able to reverse engineer it, figure out how to do it yourself for different ends or different purposes, and to repurpose some of those tools for more pro-social ends. Now, this gets into some creepy notions of like nudging and big brotheriness and so on. But when I look at the situation, I say, well, the alternative is if we don't do this, we're going to continue to have everything be fucked. I don't see how trying to do this to encourage a little bit more embodiment, a little bit more attention, a little bit more local focus is going to make us more fucked than we already are. So we might as well try.
We're already subject to these kinds of systems. So the argument that you shouldn't try benevolent ones because it's invasive, right? That just means all the systems are going to be negatively invasive.
Exactly.
There's a scale issue around abundance that intrigues me. Like you mentioned the Mars bar, right? Like Mars bar is not going to do much damage if you have one a month. It's going to do enormous damage if you have one an hour, right?
Yeah.
So it's the same, right? The calories situation is the perfect example where our ancestors evolved into a scarcity relationship with certain kinds of fats and salts and calories. Now, we have tremendous access, and we have to then adapt to a whole new evolutionary strategy in order to deal with abundance. And if we want to go forward and create a civilization of abundance, then we have to have new programs for dealing with that. Information is a huge one, right? Like if our ancestors over most of history periodically had a semantic interaction, saw a symbol once in a while, great, right? We're not built to see 10,000 an hour of potentially meaningful symbols coming at us, right? We're just in no position to be able to handle the information onslaught of the tools we have. Everything we see might be super meaningful or meaningless. All right, and that's an abundance problem, which is a scale problem. It comes down to the quantity. But when we try to think of what one solution is, obviously you back off it. But that requires a certain neurological and psychological setup, which we were just talking about, which everybody has to some degree and can be reinforced by certain kinds of life practices and embodiment. But there's huge territories, it seems to me, where we have no clue how to handle them in abundance. Like, what does it mean to live a life with too much nutrient and too much sex and too much meaningfulness, too much salience, right? These are preposterous scenarios, but they become possibilities as our level of knowledge and technical capacity increase, and we start to suffer from things at these scales that were never a problem at the small quantities of these issues. We have all new problems to solve.
Yeah, it's really interesting looking at salience in particular, because it seems to me that one of the reasons that outrage is so salient is because you were unlikely to actually experience that much true outrage, truly outrageous behavior that you witnessed in an ancestral environment. So outrage, when it did happen, was usually highly salient to your survival, right? And similarly, the experience of genuine human connection and a feeling of deep embodiment was probably so common, so abundant, that there was no need to evolve to explicitly cultivate it, because it was the water we swam in as primitive humans, as early humans in small tribal societies, right? And so now we have an interesting inversion of those dynamics, where outrage is incredibly abundant and yet still very salient because of our evolutionary heritage. And yet true human connection and embodiment and engagement with that level of our being is extremely scarce. And we're poorly calibrated to notice it as salient because it was something we could take for granted for most of our evolution. So when I think of ways to hack the incentive structure socially that might be, almost entirely net positive or pro-social, I think, how can we invert those dynamics, right? I think, how can we make human connection and embodiment more salient? And how can we make outrage less salient? And trying to take all of these tools of gamification, of weaponized attention hacking, and so on, and turn them to the good would be to flip the salience dynamics of those two things, right? So, I mean, just spitballing here, this is an absurd idea, and don't take me too literally on it, but, like gamifying, for example, how many hugs you give in a day or something like that. Of course, once we return to an environment not so laced with COVID, or gamifying the number of times that you saw an article that a machine learning system predicts would outrage you based on the headline and didn't click on it, right? And you get points for that, and you can compare those to other people and say, see, I managed to avoid 1,000 instances of potential outrage and limbic hijack today. How'd you do, right? Oh, I managed to give 500 people hugs, even though I didn't do so well on the outrage metric today. That could be a really interesting gamified system that might actually have some level of appeal to people, I think.
That's very intriguing. I love the example of, overexposure to the salience of outrage.
Yeah.
Right. And now the immediate solution that most people have is to somehow scale back from that, somehow avoid contact with the information sources that are trying to hack you with the outrage, or train yourself into a more calm body chemistry, something like that. But then there's also the option of increasing the scale or abundance of some corollary factor, like comedians seem to me to be people who can handle an enormous amount of outrage because they have a certain attitudinal approach to it, where they can use it as fuel, where when it comes in, they match it with something else, which is their inbuilt humor and intellectual skepticism, their attempt to deconstruct the sources of the outrage so that they can harness it later. Likewise, if we're getting too many semantic signals to process through our digital devices, if we match that with a kind of additional installation of a semantic gap between ourselves and that thing, then we might be in a good territory, right? There's the tragic archetypal scenario of, my teenage daughter heard a terrible thing about herself online and then killed herself, right? So you go, well, one solution is, well, we need a lot less of that, those kinds of signals. But if it's not feasible to get a lot less of those signals, then you need a lot more of something else, which is skepticism about incoming signals. You go, why did your daughter believe things she read online in the first place? What were you not giving her, right? You don't want to blame the parents for the daughter's suicide, but you want, how do you get the abundance of correlated factors that make new abundances non-problematic?
And I think this is an interesting dynamic between a sort of like sincerity and irony that we're kind of discussing here, right? And so this is like, if you look at, say, Chan culture, like 4chan and company, right? Then you have essentially the same sort of reaction that you were just advocating for there, right? Where nothing is taken so seriously that you should get outraged about it, right? Like if you get outraged, then you fed the troll. You're getting trolled now, right? Everybody's sort of got this sort of hyper ironic, attitude towards everything, right? And then if you look at some of the political movements and both on left and right, because you hear this critique of, say, the social justice left, the woke left, but you also can make this critique of a lot of movements on the right as well, where there's a complete inability to take a joke, right? There's a complete inability to joke about anything. And I think this connects deeply to the point about comedians that you were discussing before. Whatever that art of comedy is, that's severely lacking in a lot of movements with a lot of popular currency today, right? And so this is one reason I find, say, the Hansi Freinacht analysis of what metamodernity looks like, that it's this combination of sincerity and irony. It both are necessary. Neither one is sufficient by itself for navigating the hyper-networked world that we live in. And so I think that explicitly cultivating, like, for one, noticing where one stands on that spectrum. Some of us are so deeply entrenched within the hyper-ironic perspective that we seem to have lost the ability to actually have sincerely held values and to take consequences seriously, right? And then some others of us seem to be so serious and so unable to take a joke or to joke about serious topics, or we've tabooed entire areas of culture as things that you just must never joke about, such that we cannot react to this incoming flood of semantic information as you described. And so really that's one interesting thing that maybe, again, we could use some of the technologies of the modern age, sentiment analysis systems, machine learning, et cetera, to sort of customize maybe some sort of training regimen for people where, okay, you seem to be taking everything a bit too seriously right now. So we're going to give you here's an app that gamifies, cultivating a certain sense of irony, right? You, on the other hand, over here, you seem to be able to, you seem to have no consistent value structure at all. Everything's relative, everything's ironic, everything's just a joke. So maybe we're going to have a system that calibrates itself and helps train and figure out, okay, exactly what do you actually care about and what do you actually hold as maybe sacred values, and cultivating that, because it's going to be different for different people. You can't just say there's a one size fits all approach. That's part of the problem here, that different segments of society, even within given mimetic tribes, different individuals may be somewhere on the sort of sincerity to irony spectrum and not having a right relationship with the balance between those two things. And I think that's an especially interesting area of potential, like, culture hacking or culture jamming that we could take a look at,
Right now, we are dominated by, demon-like platforms that have co-opted the possibility that our digital tools are going to serve our individual needs, right? So we have the possibility to devise new tools that will customize our experience for us, but that's only going to work if we are somehow, through a relatively powerful in terms of complexity, but relatively simple in terms of interface, tool that allows us to train our digital systems, right? Like everybody's dissatisfied with their Google search results to some degree. Why? Because it's not being customized to your needs. You're not even providing feedback about whether the results were good for you or not, because you're not the client. So if this could be taken away from central platforms, if individuals could be training algorithms and digital interfaces that are adaptable to meet their needs, then they could be asking those things to provide that for them, right? It could be saying to you, hey, you remember, this isn't the kind of thing that makes you feel good. This is the kind of thing that makes you feel good because we've been tracking it because you asked us to track your well-being stats relative to incoming information, as opposed to being asked to track eyeballs relative to products. So that sense of decentralized decision-making has to be instantiated at the level of our personal control over digital tools in a way that works for us.
Absolutely. I mean, that's it right there. That is a critical part. You know, the move to centralization, the move to everything being on the cloud has done us no favors in that department, right? You know, I think about this myself, like with many years of effort, I've built a reflex into myself where if I'm feeling, you know, outraged a lot, I'm feeling like my emotional valence has gotten off kilter, one of the first things that I'll do is check in with myself about my recent information diet and say, well, is this a predictable downstream effect of the information diet that I've been consuming, or is it not? But again, that happens. I can do that in retrospect, but still, like, sometimes it'll go a week or something and I'll catch myself being, why do I feel like crap all the time? Oh, because I've been spending too much of my time consuming outrage porn, basically, right? And then I can readjust. But even just to get to the point where I notice it after a week has taken years, right? So that's a pretty big ask for, you know, the average person in circumstances like you were discussing, where there's a lot less, you know, spare resources. There's a lot less slack in the system, right? And so definitely, I think that, you know, this is something you do actually see people in the open source community working on, right? You know, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with, say, personalized recommender systems. And, you know, I think that's definitely something where we've got to figure out how to solve the interface problem, as you put it. How do we make this not just a thing that's available, but a thing that's available to people who are not huge nerds, right? You know, and that I think is probably one of the highest value in terms of social value sets of technological problems that people can be working on, is to develop personalized recommender systems, personalized information intake monitoring systems that are not just a flat turn off all sources of outrage, not just like some script that blocks, you know, the news websites or that blocks Facebook from some time period, but says at a much more granular level, how is my information intake aligning with my values, and how is this aligning with my mood over time as I track it myself in a local way that's not sold to the big companies to improve their advertising revenue or things like that. And I mean, that's probably one of the most high value interventions that we can be working on, because you've got things, of course, like, say, you know, the Consilience project, stuff that Daniel and Zach are working on with, you know, trying to improve the availability and transparency of information sources and biases and decision-making and all that kind of thing, and make that very explicit. But I don't really see that many people that are only going to look at the Consilience project and never consume any other sources of information. They're never going to go on Twitter or Facebook. They're never going to go read the New York Times or the Post or whatever. Well, you know, you still need some sort of localized monitoring to see what effects things are having on you. And that's going to be individual scale. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting area. And, you know, that's something that I'm going to take out of this conversation and say, well, I want to go find the people that are really serious about that and help them with what they're working on.
You mentioned the over time piece a couple of times, and I think it's absolutely essential because we're not that great at, right? Obviously, salience is exaggerated on short time scales. It's much more difficult to tell what's going to be valuable to us on these longer time frames. Once in a while, a person or a culture has that. There might have been, you know, the farmer or the ancient person who had to be super aware of the calendar had those longer time scales built in, but it's pretty amazing to think of someone having the idea and the will and the cooperation of others to build a pyramid, right? Let's build something that will last thousands of years when our current setup incentivizes building it so it can be thrown away for next season. So we have a very poor visceral sense of these timescales. We know in principle, mentally, we know we should be taking longer timescales into account, but our body and our emotions and our sense of energy and excitement doesn't energize on those longer timescales. They're not real enough for us. So something that can track that and present itself to us would be really important. You know, even just like, where did I put my keys earlier? Or what decision did I make about that? I know I decided about this already. Or I know when I do this for this long, it makes me feel shitty. But why didn't I notice? Why wasn't there something that helps me pay attention to that? Because I'm notoriously bad at experiencing the reality of longer time scales.
I really like that. And I'm going to take this in probably a weird direction, but this is actually something, you know, for a long time, I really hated it that people were into astrology, because I'm like, your typical rationalist type. I'm like, oh, astrology is total bullshit, right? Forget any of the predictive claims made by astrology, though. And just think about how people that get into astrology are by definition attuning themselves to longer cycles, longer timescales. And so I actually see the resurgence and interest in astrology among, you know, millennials and subsequent generations as being a net positive for this reason, because whatever else you're doing, you're paying attention to timescales at varying levels of length, you know, whether, okay, is it Mercury's in retrograde now, or whether it's, you know, the cycles of, you know, say the equinoxes, or, you know, these different precessive cycles. If you care enough about astrology to notice that, you're actually noticing cyclical things that happen over longer timescales, and it gives you some sort of metrics to base your, you know, you can say, okay, well, where was I at the beginning of this 3-month cycle, and where am I now at the end of it? Or, you know, lunar cycles, or et cetera, et cetera. I think that, you know, it's as good a shelling point as any for us to sort of, you know, congregate around. And so I actually see the renewed interest in astrology as being a very positive development in this area. And I wonder if this is one interesting way into, you know, appifying or gamifying this sort of thing, that would be a nice sort of prepackaged set of cycles that people could be cognizant of.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of real downside to interest in astrology, right? If you're already superstitious, you're already superstitious. You didn't start by being exposed to astrology. When you were exposed to astrology, you got a sense of a longer now, you got opportunities to psychologically reflect on yourself. You were asked to check in with your feelings relative to a notion of the cosmos. These are all reasonably good things. And one of the great things that classic, you know, absolutely scientifically debunked sun sign horoscopes have going for them is the simplicity and engagement of the interface, right? We obviously need a much better typology. The theory of types is the weakest part of the integral map. Myers-Briggs, the Enneagram, and the horoscope. That's kind of all we're looking at. And the horoscope is by far the most popular because it's super simple. Yeah, it's got the sense of the exotic and the sense of the familiar. You got some gems, you got some animals, you got 12, you know what months are, it all checks out, right? We need to be able to create much more complex typologies with the kind of engaging interface that the horoscope has. And that's emblematic of the move we need to make in all these other domains, where more complex, more accurate, more true systems that make better sense of the world have to come to us with the almost addictive intrigue that we get from these classic archaic interface systems that we know are the ones we are heuristically built to work with.
And so along those lines, I see a bridge here, because imagine that you start with, say, an app that gives you your sort of standard astrology stuff. Oh, you're this sun sign and this rising and this moon, and here's your chart or whatever, right? And okay, it's got some database of the sort of stereotypical, you know, traditional astrology, you know, archetype that you therefore are an example of, right? Cool. Well, then as it learns about your behavior over time, it can show you actually how you uniquely deviate from that, right? And it can show you, okay, so you give people the familiar UI, so to speak, of the traditional astrological archetypal perspective. And then over time, as this service learns about you, then it can show you your more unique character. Because I think the whole typology runs into the issue of any sort of theoretical system that it collapses certain differences between people that are actually highly relevant, right, to our individual lives. And so no typology is going to be ideal or complete because of the level of uniqueness of the human individual. So it can sort of come up with a bespoke typology based on its observation of you. This sort of reminds me of the Neil Stevenson novel, The Diamond Age. If you're familiar with that, there's this sort of nanotech book in there which learns about its reader to teach them virtue as it gets to know them better. And, I think we're kind of on the verge of being able to have systems like that.
Yeah, it's got to be bespoke, well-informed, and it, like you say, it mimics the process of human understanding and adaptivity, right? Which is we always start by having a few simple ideas. And if they are engaging, we go to the next level of nuance and the next level of informational richness. So it's got to be able to seduce us forward in a manner that mimics learning and wisdom development, which is how we are built to operate, with a progressive adaptation to some kind of niche, physiological or informational. I think my family's about to come back with dinner, but now that we've explained why scale variance proves astrology, I think we're good for now.
I love it.
But this was fantastic. I would like to do a few more of these with you because these are extremely rich and engaging topics. And like we said a few times earlier, there's a lot of conversations here that need to be had that people are not having in these communities.
Yeah, I'm super happy to do that. It's been a really fun conversation. I had put together some notes on things we might explore, and I think we got to maybe 5% of them. So yeah, a lot of material here to be mined and refined, and I'm happy to do it whenever it works out for you.
All right, we'll set another one up. Good talking with you, man.
Always a pleasure.